And with that August introduction, welcome to Peachy Talks here at Prince George Daily News. It's our weekly panel where we discuss all things that are going on in the world, or at least some of them. I'm joined today by Tracy Calogheros and Chuck Nisbett. Todd Corrigal and Mackenzie Kerr couldn't make it today, although they may join in later. Hopefully they will log in and we can get going with them. But let's get started. We can let's continue with the last week. We talked a little bit about the or talked a lot about the Kamloops Residential School. The discovery of 215 bodies there and the ramifications that this is happening throughout the country. Tracy, do you think that that this is perhaps an issue that will finally turn a corner in Indigenous relations in this country and not be just another thing that it kind of flares up and then dies down and nothing changes?
Yeah, I think that that's the goal here. And my experience in the last week or so in talking to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous friends and colleagues is that this discovery has had an impact in the non-Indigenous community that there hasn't been before on a wide basis. So I no longer see the denials out there. I do think that if there is anything good to come of this, it's that the debate is over and it is now about healing and finding the rest of these missing children and acknowledging the genocide and the harm done, and then starting to work collectively to move forward. I can't see this dying out anytime soon in terms of public discussion and in really moving forward truth and reconciliation.
Chuck, what about you? Is this a corner turn? So you're like me, you got to change your glasses every 5 minutes.
Different strokes for different situations. Like Tracy, I'd have to say that I've seen a lot of, I've been contacted and talked to a lot of people, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous, all talking about this, all seeing that there has to be something done going forward. And most of all, I've heard people ask for the records. What's coming next? When will the records from the residential schools be released? How are we going to make this happen? I've had that asked as well. I think people have come to the point where they've realized that this really happened, and they're starting to realize what impact it had on the people that were involved. And I think they're starting to feel like something has to be done, something strong has to be done, something direct and positive has to be done, not some we're sorry and let's not let this happen again. People are looking to see what's going to go down in the future and find out why it happened in the past. So yeah, I can see things moving forward now. I think everybody is starting to look forward to seeing what the reasonings behind this mass grave and other ones that may be discovered are, and why nobody's ever heard of it before.
Yeah, I think that your comment about records is going to be really important. And I've seen some discussion in the museum community around those of us that hold records for dioceses and for other religious orders and getting those records released. The Royal BC Museum holds a significant collection, but they don't have legal control over it until 2027. And so that debate is now happening as to how they can get control of the collection to be allowed to release it sooner than 2027. And I suspect that there are similar issues throughout. I mean, we hold some material from the diocese here in town, but we don't have complete records. And so I think that not only is it talking to the religious orders in the diocese, but we also need to be talking to our museums and our archives, because all of that information is absolutely necessary and it needs to be available right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting about the records. I watched question period on the weekend with Evan Solomon, and he had on the lawyer who took the Catholic Church to court in Boston. If you've seen the movie Spotlight, you know what that's all about. And that was all about sexual abuse cases in the church. And his one piece of advice was subpoena the records and subpoena them right now. He said, because he obviously didn't trust the church, because he said they will be out and literally having a bonfire.
Yeah.
And he said it's interesting because only the Archbishop has the key to the secret files. I guess they actually call them secret files, and they do get destroyed after time. However, there is a summary kept of them. But his advice to Canada was, don't wait, subpoena those records, because they will be, once they're destroyed, then the church can easily say, they're destroyed. So, yeah, and the other part is the federal records, because there has to be some federal records.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, the federal government was a huge part of this, right? It was their initiative that started this whole thing. So there's got to be records and information available from the federal government. I mean, we have Trudeau saying the other day that the Catholic Church needs to come clean. Well, I think that stands for the federal government as well. Everybody's got to come clean on this. We all need to hear what happened. And I think everything that's available needs to be put forward so that people can assess what really happened. It's not time for lies and deceit. It's time to be open and honest. And let's try and use this in a way to bring things to a closer closure than we've had so far. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was supposed to do that, but it didn't quite get everything. It didn't get all the way. And this is proof that it didn't get all the way. And I think we need to step beyond that now and just let it all out and deal with it, work our way through it.
Historic records tend to be very enlightening as well, because they're written by people who are living in the day. And so the norms for society and the accepted language and approach to other ethnic groups are often on very clear display in the notes and the reports that are within them. I know in talking to Clifford Qua, an elder of the Lheidli and a survivor of Lejac, in this past week, one of the things he repeated a couple of times is that there were no registered nurses or doctors at any of these sites. And he believes that it was specifically to avoid record keeping, that anyone that was a registered member of the profession would be required to retain records, but that in many cases, and in all cases in his experience, there were none of those folks employed at these schools, even though they ought to have been, and that he believes it was really around not having to retain records of what had happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's I think is probably one of the crimes here, especially like for the church, they seem to have records going back centuries about stuff they want to. Right? You would hope that they would keep some of the records regarding this. Like simple things like names of who's in your care. To think that there are no records of that is mind-boggling, and yet it seems that perhaps that's the way it was. Had a bunch of kids, give them numbers rather than names, and away you went. That is, like I said, that's mind-boggling.
It really is. That's kind of you can't imagine that happening now, right? I mean. Having a school without anybody knowing who exactly attended it. I mean,
but these so-called schools didn't even have accredited teachers in them.
No.
I think again, you have to think about the period and the way people thought. And so the whole idea of creating these residential schools was because the belief was out there in the non-Indigenous community that somehow they were inferior or subhuman. Mm-hmm. And so why would they keep records if they didn't believe that these people had a history and a culture and a family that was worth preserving? In fact, they wanted to eradicate it. Why would they keep records of them? Because they certainly wouldn't have been worth it, according to the thinking of the day. it's the journals from the nuns and the fathers that were on the sites that I think are going to be the most illuminating in terms not just of the attitude of the people that were in control of these young lives, but the people that were there and some of the things that happened. I don't know that we will ever have the whole story. And again, this is one of those places where it's so important to recognize that the oral traditions coming to us from the elders are an absolutely valid form of history. Just because it's not written down in a Western book does not make it any less accurate or any less valid. And they've been telling us for a very long time about what happened at these residential schools. This concrete proof may be what we needed in the non-Indigenous world to wake all of us up, but it's not news to any of my Indigenous friends.
Mhm. Yeah, I've said that from pretty much the beginning. I think anybody who's been around Indigenous communities or known anyone who is a residential school survivor knows very much that this is the discovery was shocking but not surprising. And I think you're hearing that in a lot of places. You know, because there always were stories that you know, kids just disappeared. And, yeah.
Yeah, and you know, it mirrors the whole African slave experience down in the States, where records were not really kept of who owned who, what, and where, and the oral stories were passed on through the 8 years from generation to generation, so that people knew where they came from and who their grandparents were and where they were raised. And you know, it's very, very similar, and it's a similar way of thinking that um, people of color were of lesser intelligence and not worthy of the same consideration as the Europeans. And it was a different time. It really was a different time. You know, people just didn't think the same. And
You're 100% right, Chuck. And I hadn't thought about it from the Black slave community, but again, it would be the oral tradition that mattered. And this Western idea that the only kind of history that matters is that which is written in a book, the histories in books are far more flawed than the histories you hear from your grandmother. It's a really interesting shift in thinking broadly, but particularly within the Western so-called developed world, that this Indigenous ways of knowing is the term I'm familiar with, but I absolutely think it needs to be expanded to include Black culture coming out of slavery in the US, and probably other cultures that I'm just not familiar with. I think that we need to embrace these other ways of knowing and recognize the flaws in our own Western schooling and historical record keeping.
Mhm. Yeah, it's one of those funny things is that part of the Western thing is we tend to ignore experience as a value, or we don't tend not to value it. You know, I think of just some of the issues I have. We've on the farm I have, we've had issues with flooding, and we've had all kinds of experts come in and tell them, and we can tell them because we've lived on that. My family's lived there for over 100 years. We can tell them what the history is of that area, and they simply don't listen because we're not an engineer, we're not a geologist, we're not, you know, and it's the same sort of thing, right? It's kind of like, well, we know because we've been here, and I don't want to equate my little woes there with the issue that's going on in residential schools. So in the Twitter world, don't sacrifice me to the altar there because they're making a comparison. But we do tend to forget that there is human experience and there is value in that, and we do our experience should count. You know, everyone's experience should count. So and
I
yeah.
will say, Bill, that you will not get sacrificed to Twitter on that one, because I'll tell you, at 25, I would have killed you for that statement. At 51, I recognize the value those years have brought to my thinking and to my wisdom. And so if you can extrapolate that up to time immemorial and hundreds and thousands of years of experience, we're ignoring it at our own peril. And that's where you see things like climate change out of control in this world.
Mhm.
You know, I grew up in England, and England's it's an old culture. You know, it is, and the people there are packed together really tightly. So there's a lot of different um, little sects growing up together and trying to stay separate and together, which is kind of a weird thing to say, but you know, they're trying to do their own thing, and at the same time, they're trying to work together. So there's a huge amount of record keeping in Britain, and at the same time, the oral traditions of some of the nomadic peoples that wandered through the islands, the Isle of England or Britain and Ireland, and some of the smaller sects that lived off in the different corners, their oral traditions are really considered there as well. They're really, and when I was a child, they were starting to bring a lot of the information from um, the different oral traditions forward. And I don't know, it seemed to stop at the sea. It never got across. You know, it never came here.
Too bad the rest of Britain got across that sea. They're pretty much the definition of colonialism.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I think it kind of needed to do a little more stretching out from Mother England, and it should have gone away with the rest of colonialism, but it never quite got here, and so I don't think anyone's really considered the oral traditions as much as they do there.
Well, it's pretty hard to dehumanize an entire population in another world if you listen to their oral traditions. So I would suspect that it was a conscious choice in the push to populate the world, that oral traditions were ignored.
Well, and that's another part of let's get rid of their language and you know, their culture, right? Let's just shove it all down and they become us.
Without a doubt. And when you eliminate language, you change those oral traditions, because there are many concepts and ideas that are just simply not translatable into English or French or Spanish or anything else. They belong in that native language. And that's where this decimation of Indigenous language in North America is really so harmful. And it's not just harmful to the Indigenous people who would speak that as their mother tongue, but to all of the rest of us that are losing the benefit of all of that experience and wisdom.
Yeah, as the saying goes, lost in translation. Right? And there's so much that's lost in translation if you try to force translation on everything, which is essentially what we did, right? Or better yet, at that time it was hopefully everybody forgets it. That was the underlying goal of residential schools and all that kind of stuff, was to drive that Indigenous culture out of all the Indigenous people. So, and I think that's one of the things that's come out of this, that's hard, I hate to say it's a positive, but it's awakening for a lot of people, is that's exactly what we were trying to do, is make those people someone they're not. And that's just wrong on so many levels, right? I don't know. I'm losing my train of thought here, but I'll switch up a little bit. One of the things that's come out of this is a renewed call for us to focus on statues and all that kind of stuff. You know, at Ryerson University, the statue of is it, I can't remember, it's Emmett Ryerson or Emerson Ryerson, was torn down and basically
Egerton,
destroyed.
isn't it? Egerton Ryerson?
An E name, I couldn't remember what it was. It'd be bad because it's the premier journalism school in the country, so or it was. But you know, there's those, and you know, Jason Kenney got some hot water this week about we shouldn't be in a rush to tear down Johnny McDonald statues and Langevin and all those guys. I don't know, Tracy, do you think it's time that maybe we should for some of these?
Without a doubt, there's an awful lot of them that need to come out of these central public squares where they are being held up as venerated individuals. It's not that they didn't have a role to play. They clearly had roles to play that had impacts both good and bad. I think the evolution of society is such that as we have learned more about the harm and the damage that some of these, well, we're talking colonialism, so let's talk colonialism, that's a lot of those approaches have had. I don't know why we would continue to celebrate these individuals in the way that we have. I think that all human beings are complicated and full of contradictions, and so is all leadership. So when you start to talk about sculptures that are a piece of public art and that are in these squares for the public to come upon deliberately or unexpectedly, it really shouldn't be the kinds of individuals that we're celebrating that have such a negative impact on cultures like the Indigenous people in North America. I think the museum industry has a role to play. The art gallery industry has a role to play. Personally, I favor the approach of removing them and collecting them together into a sculpture garden whose entire purpose is to talk about the problematic histories and the conversations that we're having as our knowledge and our understanding of each other evolves. There could be a very powerful use for these sculptures. In some cases, too, they are independent works of art in and of themselves and shouldn't be destroyed because of the piece of art that they are. But I do think they need to be moved. And I think when we're talking about changing names, that's another place that it makes a lot of sense to change names and to have them evolve as society and cultural understanding and awareness evolves. So, we can go back to, I forget which year it was that they changed the name from Fort George Park to Clately to Memorial Park. And there was hue and cry in the community. There were so many people upset about it and so many people thrilled about it. Flash forward to now, and folks are still up in arms about the change of name, but it's less and less prominent. And every time that discussion comes up, we have the opportunity to talk about the forced expulsion of the Clately people from what is now known as Clately Memorial Park, the role the Indian agent and the government played in that, the deceit and the deception and the racism that was right at the foreground of that, which was perfectly acceptable at the time and is absolutely unacceptable as we know better now. And I think that those kinds of sculptures and discussions, name changes, they need to happen. You'll see it hit the press here locally in the next little bit as there's a discussion publicly about O'Grady and the role that he had in the North here and the various things that are named in his honor. There's also the sculpture, the mosaic that's down in front of the old Four Seasons pool that definitely needs to be removed. So there are a number of areas that we can have these conversations on a local level. And I think it always gives us the opportunity to talk about the local story and the local people and the local impacts. And that is where museums and art galleries have a role to play.
Mm-hmm. Chuck, what are your thoughts? Statues come down, blow them up, leave them where they are?
Since we talked last week, I've looked more and more into the whole sculpture garden idea that Tracy mentioned then, and I've really come to think that that's the way to go, because it does preserve the art, and there's no doubt that some of these are amazing pieces of art, and some sculptors have worked long and hard to produce these pieces that are fantastic, but it also gets them out of the everyday workings of life, right? So that if you're a Native person that was at the Kamloops School, you're not going to have to walk by, say, a statue that's going to bring back those memories, or the that unfortunate mural down at the Four Seasons pool. Let's get that out so you don't have to sit there and look at that every day. And that is not what I meant by art, by the way. It's not. Take a close look. It's not good. But, you know, you have these things off to the side. So when you do have a class come through, or a family or a group come through, they can look at it and they can read the story behind it. They can understand the things that Johnny McDonald did that were fantastic, but they can also understand the things that he did that we don't see as right anymore. You know, and we goes a ways to telling the story of how we became the way we are. You know, and I think that's really important too. So yeah, let's not destroy them, but let's move them out of the way and let's put them to a constructive use. I think that's the way to go forward. I really do.
And none of these conversations are easy, and they really shouldn't happen by accident because you happen to walk past a sculpture of John A. Macdonald. However, if you want to have a teaching moment and you want the opportunity to explore these subjects in depth and with sensitivity, you go specifically to this sculpture garden or whichever solution is found. And then you're prepared to have that conversation. I mean, we've heard a lot and learned a lot in the last couple of weeks about emotional labor and triggering events, and even requesting more information from our indigenous friends can do such harm and damage to them. So I think that sculptures have to be looked at the same way.
And yeah, Tracy, you talk about, just get back to the naming thing. You know, you're right in that over time names will be accepted. You know, it's here in BC, we probably have a generation now who are not, if you said Queen Charlotte Islands, they wouldn't know what they are, because that was changed. I don't know when we changed that to Haida Gwaii, but it was quite a few years ago now, and now it's just accepted, and I can't really remember if there was a hue and cry to the change of that name at the time or not. But you know, and same as Clayton Tenay Memorial Park, it becomes the accepted norm. And I think if we get so attached to some of these things, we have to wonder why we're so hung up on names. I know they're important, they're symbolic and that kind of thing, but I don't see why we can't change names of things. You know,
people always talk about we're erasing history, or we're whitewashing history, or eliminating history, and that simply isn't true. You know, history is not a place in which you are supposed to live. History is a place that you visit and that you learn from. And that's why we invest as a culture in historical teaching, in museums, in holding permanent collections for communities safe in perpetuity. Most museums only have maybe 10 to 20% of their permanent collection on exhibit at any given time. But that's not to say that the other 80% of what we're holding isn't absolutely important. It is. And I think that it's important for people to recognize that history really is meant to be instructional, not meant to be the place where you reside and use as your weapon to resist all change and evolution and thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've said this before, I think we should enact a policy where we stop naming things after people. Because as this shows up, you know, as this is highlighted rather dramatically, virtually everyone is flawed. You know, doesn't matter who you are as a political leader. There's going to be someone who didn't like you. You know, and you know, we all talk about John A. Macdonald and, you know, the father of Confederation and all that. And I'm sure there was lots of liberals alive at that time who hated his guts. You know.
I'm sure that's true. I really am.
I totally agree. Liberals are not a homogenous group.
But, you know, I think that's sort of one of the lessons, is that, you know, we tend to deify a lot of people simply because A, they were politicians, and G, they managed to convince everybody else at the budget table to build that bridge. You know,
it's been that way since Ramses the Great and Cleopatra.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
It's tough, and I think it's maybe something that it's time we get away from, you know.
Yeah, maybe let's get back to nature. Let's call it Oak Hall, or, you know, Elm Elm Street or whatever you want to do it, but just stay away from people's names because, well, look, now we've got O'Grady High and O'Grady Road and you name it, that pretty soon I'm sure they're not going to be O'Grady anything. Um, and it's unfortunate that it's going to mean that everything has to be changed along the way, right? But that's the way it is. I mean, we're learning what happened in the past and seeing what fits with our collective conscience now. And I don't think Bishop O'Grady is going to quite sit in there for too much longer.
But that will be an interesting one to see how the church handles that, because that O'Grady Road and that area up there, that was all Catholic land at one time.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure whether they sold it to the city or they granted a lot of that land to the city. And I'm sure part of the quid pro quo there was that, we will, we'll give you some naming rights and all that kind of stuff. And remember the bishop and all that kind of stuff. So, of course, you could go back further and say, well, the land that the Catholic Church had was stolen from. but still, the church would likely argue that look, we gave this land to the city or sold it to the city for a dime or whatever they did. So they should have some rights to continue to have their say on what happens there or whatever it is. So I don't know. It's just I don't.
That's a bad argument. That one's going to go right down a dead end because you immediately just return with that land never belonged to anyone to have sold it to the church in the first place.
Yeah.
And so you want rights. We're talking Indigenous title.
Yeah, I think it was granted to the church. That's what usually happens.
And I believe the church sold it to the developers for the Walmart parking area or shopping area there because the school had closed and they had no money coming in.
Yeah, my understanding is it was sold at fair market value and the church did just fine in that sale.
Yeah.
But the other opportunity here now is to have this conversation. Let's talk about who O'Grady was. Let's talk about what he did that was good and what he did that was bad and have a fulsome public conversation about it and then make a determination as a community as to whether or not those are the values that we think we should be upholding today by venerating someone with a naming opportunity. And I think if we make those naming opportunities more public and more inclusive, we will get better names, whether it's naming them after a Clately word like Lapco for the Fraser River, or naming them after an explorer like Simon Fraser. Those are conversations we should be having collectively, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that would certainly help is that, we put it out to doing some of this stuff, put it out to the public, like you say, and have that discussion and go from there. Because it makes it very, very tough, and you can think or try to believe that you're doing the right thing, but there could be a whole segment of the population that you're alienating and without knowing it, or maybe without knowing it, but you choose to ignore it, whichever one it is. But I think in this day and age, we have to be cognizant of that, and that's part of the change I think that's going on in society is that we are now cognizant of it. Back when Confederation came, it was kind of like, well, we're doing this and everybody else be damned, and we've learned that that's not the right way to do things.
Yeah, we'll be naming everything after big tummy white men in tan tamants, and that'll be it.
Well, that's what we did, right? There's so much named after the, basically the Europeans that came here, and they're all men.
It's easier now, I think, to get people's opinions. It's not as expensive as it used to be, where you had to have a full referendum and everything for any kind of information. Electronically now, you could collect so much information and get an idea of what people thought.
Just don't make it a binding vote. That Bodie McBoatface thing that went around a few years ago for the ferry was instructional in terms of putting it out to the internet to name things.
I think you have to limit people to one vote per. That was terrible. Oh dear. But yeah, I
But
think you could do it.
that we should take a look at, because we just, like I said, in the past, we just, I think too many politicians or whoever just wanted to name things after their friends or whoever they thought was great, which turns out that they really weren't. So just try to avoid that in the future, I think. So
It's interesting because they continue to rename mountains and things for various folks. And there
yes.
doesn't seem to be an outcry when that happens. I'm thinking about, even the one that comes to mind is the Terry Fox Mountain, but I know there's other mountains that have been renamed within my lifetime that clearly had names prior to that. So we're pretty good at renaming. We just have an issue when we rename from an English old white guy to something else, but we're always fine to rename anything else to an English old white guy.
Well, there was Mount Pierre Elliott Trudeau created quite a bit of a stir when they renamed that. I do remember that. And I can't remember exactly what the name of that mountain was previously.
It wouldn't have mattered. People just hate Trudeau.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Trudeau, I think. Yeah. Well, yeah.
It's pretty much was going to go down bad no matter what it was before. You just had to call it Trudeau, and that was it was going to be a problem. You know, I mean, Terry Fox. Yeah, everybody stops and checks out Terry Fox, right? But yeah.
Well, there are,
you know,
there are. When I say we should stop naming things after people, there are some people that kind of rise above, you know. And I think that's where the standard we should set. You know, like Terry Fox would be one. Rick Hansen is another. And I'm sure there's people in their lives that they pissed off from time to time. You know, but you know, their accomplishments were you know, pretty substantial. And
yeah.
so there are a
And
few
generally selfless. These weren't about someone furthering a political career or an industry agenda. These are people that were giving of themselves selflessly to their fellow humanity. And that, I think, is something that deserves recognition.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But you know,
Yeah.
getting reelected 5 times is not a real good reason to be you know, have something named after you.
No, in fact, it could be a recommendation against.
It's exactly it.
Because if you're
As the girl who's never won an election.
Yeah, I shouldn't use that example. Or that's probably it.
Oh dear.
But let's switch up the topics a little bit. The other news that came out this week was the legal review of the downtown parkade project for City Hall, and that was it laid out a pretty good timeline for what went on with that. And you know, I think for me, one of the key things that you know, was an eye opener is that the city went into this and basically agreed to a deal that the developer drafted up. They didn't even vet the agreement, and then they went ahead with it. The other is the delegated authority, which was changed during the process, which allowed then City Manager Kathleen Soltis to approve larger cost overruns on it. Had City not changed that process, none of this would have happened, or you hope it wouldn't happen. So I don't know, Tracy, have you been following this, and what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I have been following it, and I think on the one hand, it is nice to see that there is nobody stuffing their jeans with fraudulent money. I mean, there's a big difference between making a poor decision and deliberately trying to obfuscate something. So I don't really feel that there was anything deliberate that went on. I think that maybe there were some systems in place that needed some refining, and there was definitely more attention that needed to be paid in some areas. But the fact of the matter is, most of this happened at the same time as all of northern BC was on fire, and most of the world was descending on Prince George here and looking for care. So I think we also have to remember that these are human beings that work for the city, and they're making choices and decisions within a context that is their own personal world too. And Prince George was definitely literally on fire in mid 2018 there. Well, the city wasn't, but around us certainly was. And the city was the one that was acting as the home for all those folks. Now, in terms of things that need to be changed, yeah, there's obviously some attention that needs to be paid to the process of going through contracts and making determinations around who is going to decide on how much we're going to spend on what. You know, we've said all along, and the city has said all along, that the expenditures that happened on the project were not wrong to have made. They were expenditures that, if the project was going to go ahead, were going to have to be made. So they were legitimate expenses. It was just about that initial negotiation between the developer and the city. I think that there's still questions around how all of that netted out. But on balance, I'm glad the report was done. I'm glad it was made public. And I think that the city will respond to the recommendations within it. Ultimately, we've got some really good projects that have happened, lots more folks moving into that downtown, and that's where we're going to start to see the real shift in the look of our downtown, the participation in our downtown. You know, folks have been talking about that since I moved here in 1992, and it's been the last 5 years that I've seen significant change, and it's all around building services and high density housing in that downtown core. So I don't know. I think all the way around, we've got the info that we needed, and now it's just a case of making sure it gets acted on.
Chuck, did you follow the report, and what's your thoughts on
Yeah,
what transpired?
I actually read through the report, and yeah, it was very interesting to read, and I think it was something that definitely had to be done, and I'm happy the city did it the way they did and released it the way they did, so that everybody could read it and make their own assumptions from the information available. Um, that said, I don't agree entirely that nobody's stuffed their pockets. I think the developers stuffed their pockets very full. Um, there was this is a major increase, like 3 times the cost, right? And the city, yeah, there was a lot going on, and they didn't really take the time to think where it could go. But nobody would think that the budget would be 3 times over what it was originally meant to cost, right? So I don't really blame the city for how that went. Um, but that said, the contractor, wow, they took everything they could, you know, and they really went to town. That's 3 times what was originally budgeted for that project. That's unheard of, really. I mean, I've heard of lots of cost overruns. I've heard of cost overruns of 35, 40%, where people have been like, wow, how could it possibly be? This is 300% here. You know, that's a lot of money.
My understanding though, Chuck, and maybe I've got it wrong, was that a lot of those expense increases had to do with unforeseen engineering issues. Now, should those engineering issues have been unforeseen? No, I don't think they should have been. And that's where I have an issue. I really do think that the issues there around underground systems and water tables is no different than what happened at the Willow Kale. So I'd like to know what is wrong with our engineering, that we don't seem to know what's going on under the ground before we get into these projects and then wind up with really expensive change orders.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like that should have been looked at beforehand. I mean, if you're designing something into an existing system, don't you look at the existing system and see how everything's going to integrate? That makes sense to me. So why was it a surprise suddenly that there were water table problems and you know everything had to be changed to integrate the city heating project? That
Yeah,
was all there. The plans and engineering was done beforehand for that. So why couldn't that have been integrated into the initial design right away? That shocks me.
yeah, I agree. I think that's one of the downsides here, is that nobody at the city seemed to be aware that these could be an issue. And it's not like we haven't built in that area in the last little while. You know, there's Whittick's gone up, and there's the hotel gone up, and that had its own issues there. You know, there's other buildings in that immediate area that the city has been involved in some sort of capacity with. And you think that these issues they would have known. It's kind of like, you know, okay, if you're building in Whittick, well, you need to do this to hook up, and you know there's going to be water table issues. and you build almost literally across the street and seem to forget that there's water table issues. That to me is a tough part. The other one the part of this that came out very clearly, I think, was that it exonerated, if you want to use that term, Lynn Hall for having knowledge of all this and sitting on it. Because I know the citizen, they did some FOI stuff, and good on them for doing that. They were, they're looking, and that's what media needs to do. And there was an email that went to Lynn Hall in 2018 from Kathleen Soltis, basically saying that there's some cost overruns. And he's maintained that he got that email, but they didn't get anything since. And the inference or the feel from a lot of people is that, oh, he must have known. But they said that the report said that nothing else went to Lynn about this, so he was kept in the dark as well. Tracy, do you think that this sort of exonerates Lynn, or maybe speak to the what this speaks to City Hall, where there's this going on and the mayor's kept out of the loop?
Yeah, I think, again, it's always important to remember how city council and staff operate, and Kathleen is the sole employee of city council. So I always equate it to my own experience at the museum, and I'm the only employee of the museum board, and the museum board chair and I are the interacting pivot for the board and the museum team. Mm-hmm. And so Kathleen and Lynn would have been the same. Realistically, if I chose not to inform my board chair of something, my board chair simply wouldn't know until it came to light down the road. That would be an actionable thing, and that would cost me my job, and so it should. But it's entirely plausible that I could conceal something from my board chair, at least until we got to audit, if I chose to. I'm not saying that that's what Kathleen did, but I do think that it's entirely plausible that Lynn was out of the loop. And I believe that our mayor has done a really good job in the work that he's been doing in the time that he's been elected to represent all of us. And the amount of growth in building in our downtown core in particular, but citywide really, is exceptional. And I don't think that you could point to another mayor at any time in history, unless you're going back into the 60s when the mills were getting built, that would see such a significant impact, not just on today's Prince George, but on the next 100 years of Prince George. And so where we have a project like this, that he's told us up front that he didn't know what was going on, and then was perfectly okay with an external review of it, to me, that tells us all along that Lynn had nothing to hide from this community. I believe that he is passionate about our community, and that his primary focus is always on trying to better things. So I could never believe the accusations that were being leveled at him, nor did I ever think it was appropriate to be demanding his resignation. I'm glad he's our mayor, and I'm certainly pleased that he's there serving us at the moment as we work through this pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Chuck, you echo those thoughts, or got some?
I pretty much echo those all the way down the road. Lynn Hall, I think, has done a fantastic job. I really think he's a fantastic mayor. I really do. I think he's a stand-up guy. He's really honest. He works really hard, and he's juggling a lot of stuff, and he's trying to keep ahead of it, and he's doing a damn fine job, I gotta say. Yeah, I don't think we could really, I don't know of anybody who could step into his shoes and do as good a job right now. And yeah, this thing got out of control. And I think mostly, and there's some speculation here on my part, that it's mostly to do with the fact that they gave the city manager a huge amount of leeway, and had a control of a large chunk of budget that never should have had control of without going to the council for more direction. And yeah, anybody should have thought that you would go and say, look, this is going this far, and maybe we should do something about it. But she really didn't have to. She was told, you got $7 million or whatever it was to play with, go ahead. And so she did. And I think it's unfortunate the way that played out, but I don't think you can blame Lynn for that directly, and I don't think you can say that he hasn't done an exemplary job for this city. Um, I think he has been exonerated by this report. Um, he's been straight up with what he knew all the way. He's not once said, I don't remember. He said, I know that I got this, and that's it. That's all I know. And it just says, he got this, and that's it. So, yeah, I think the man has done a great job, and I think it's time for people to stop busting his balls.
Well, one of the interesting things, personally, when I interviewed Lynn about one of the questions I asked him was what he thought or what he believed the political fallout would be of this for him and city council. And he was literally taken aback by that question, and he had no answer. And then he just kind of like, what he said was that it never occurred to me what there's a political fallout or anything like that. That was never on his mind. And I believe him when he said that, because when I asked the question, he was literally almost dumbfounded by it. It's kind of like, what do you mean political fallout? Because it just seems like it never had entered his mind that this is a political issue and it could be damaging to him or other members of council. So, I think that sort of speaks along with what you guys are just saying. Like Chuck saying, he's a stand-up guy. So I think, yeah, he was doing his best, and things got out of hand.
As we've discussed already today, nobody is perfect. Everyone is going to make mistakes. The question is how you deal with those mistakes once they're made. And I believe that our political leadership has dealt with them. Lynn stepped up, got the report done, owned his part of it, and there's been staffing changes already at City Hall. So what more can we really ask for? If we try and demand perfection from our political leaders, all we're doing is asking them to lie to us. So I think we have to accept that people do make mistakes and give them the opportunity to right them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it should be pointed out that the city has, prior to this report, rolled back the delegated authority amount that the city manager has. That to me, that was one of the enablers in this. If the city manager didn't have that authority at the time, she would have had to go to City Hall to get that authority, and if she wouldn't have, then that's, like Tracy says, an actionable offense, because that would have been, tantamount to fraud. And Kathleen Soltis is smart enough to know that she's not going to go down that road.
I think too that it would be nice if our political leadership, and I'm not just talking municipal here, I'm talking all levels of political leadership, would stop making every issue a partisan matter and making every issue you've got to resign or you need to be unelected. We need to elect these people to work for us and then allow them to do that work until the next writ drops. This idea that you get elected and then spend the next 4 years grandstanding to get reelected, I think is hugely damaging to our communities and to our culture. And so your comments, Bill, that Lynn never even considered that there could be political fallout from this does my heart good, because that's exactly how I wish all political leadership was.
Yeah, I agree 100%. You get in, you do your job, just concentrate on it. And I think that's the way Lynn works too, exactly. He just works at what's in front of him, what needs to be done. Doesn't think about whether it's politically good for him or bad for him or how it's going to work out at the next election. He's just going at what needs to be done, and that's why he was surprised when you said that, because he never thought of it. It never crossed his mind. He's just like, well, I'm just doing my job. Oh, shit. You think people aren't going to like that? And I think that's the way he is. And I wish that's the way all politicians were. Don't politic. Get in, do your job. That's what we need.
And on that point, we're getting up to an hour, so we'll do the usual quick plugs that we want to get in. Tracy, you got something to plug before we
I do. At the request of the Lheidli Nation, we have at the museum, we took down the memorial to the 215 children found at Kamloops Residential School. And the chief and I discussed this yesterday, and we decided that the public was still looking for a place to mourn and to grieve and to perhaps leave items. So we've reinstalled the memorial at the exploration place in Clayton Tenay Memorial Park, facing the river, as would be culturally appropriate. You can see the display through the windows of the museum atrium, and we invite the public to continue to bring items if you would like. We are asking that they be organic items because the collection is already physically very large, and we are going to keep it for the Clayton Tenay for permanent display down the road. Any additions to it, we ask they be smudge bundles or flowers, those sorts of things that can then be burned periodically in a fire, as we've been instructed by elders of Indigenous communities surrounding us.
Right on. Chuck, any plug, the usual plug, or anything else?
Well, for me, I'd just like to say, just look around, you know. There's a bunch of us in this place. We don't all look the same, but we're all the same inside. And just look around and give each other a hug every now and then and just say, hey, let's make it work, right? You know, just keep an open mind and an open heart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll finish off with a plug. The Calogheros Family Services is planning a 3-day sacred fire ceremony at Lejac to release the souls of the 215 children found buried at Kamloops Residential School. And that will take place June 18th, 19th, and 20th. Opening ceremony on June 19th, etc., etc. So something that may want to take part in if you're so moved, and I think it will be it's an important ceremony for the people out there, because as bad as the Kamloops school was, Lejac is another one that just, when people talk about that, it was just a bad, nasty place. So yeah, lots of healing needs to go on there. And on that note, I thank Tracy and Chuck and everybody who's watching for tuning in, and we will be back again next week.